Welcome, traveler. Settle in. The night is quiet, the world has slowed, and the stars are watching with lazy curiosity. This is your time to drift, not to sleep just yet, but to wander through an older world where gods walked among vineyards and laughter carried farther than prayers. If stories like these help you unwind, if you enjoy drifting into ancient myths retold in soft light and slow rhythm, then gently tap subscribe and let the stories find you again when night returns. There are many more waiting, strange, thoughtful, and a little bit drunk on wonder. Now take a breath, let the noise of the day fade, and follow me back to a time when the god of wine tried to teach a village how to party politely. If you happen to live in ancient Boeotia, around the time when the olive trees were still considered new and the roads between villages were mostly the domain of wandering goats, you might have heard rumors about a stranger who never walked in a straight line. He was said to be handsome, but in a slightly worrying way, the kind of person who smiled as though he knew a joke you were too sober to understand. This was Dionysus, son of Zeus and Semele, god of wine, of revelry, of liberation, and curiously, of extremely poor time management. Dionysus was not the punctual type. His followers often claimed he existed in a kind of flexible chronology, where days might stretch or collapse depending on how long a party lasted. The problem was that mortals did not live according to divine hangovers. They had crops to tend, grain to thresh, and reputations to maintain. When the god announced, by means of an ecstatic priestess, that he intended to personally visit the small town of Mytica to teach them the proper etiquette of celebration, the reaction was mixed. The elders of Mytica, ever cautious about divine visitors, assembled a committee. The committee was immediately divided into two camps: those who believed hosting a god would bring prosperity, and those who feared that prosperity might come with livestock mysteriously vanishing and amphorae of wine exploding in the night. It was decided, after 3 days of tedious deliberation, that they would, in principle, welcome Dionysus, but only if he agreed to observe a few rules. First, there would be no spontaneous vines sprouting from the town well. Second, no inducing of mass ecstasy without prior notice. And third, perhaps most importantly, no transformations of mortal citizens into dolphins, regardless of provocation. The letter, written on a remarkably dry piece of papyrus, was dispatched by a hesitant courier. It took 6 months to arrive. Dionysus naturally ignored it. When he finally appeared, it was early spring. The air smelled of crushed rosemary and damp stone, and the first buds of grapevines were curling shyly around the walls of the town. He entered not through the gates, but along a goat path, accompanied by a band of maenads who looked like they hadn't stopped dancing since last harvest. Their tambourines rattled softly, their feet made no sound at all. The villagers, alerted by a shepherd boy who had spotted the glittering procession from a hillside, came running to greet, or perhaps to contain, the visitor. Dionysus stopped at the fountain in the square. It was dry, the town had been saving water for irrigation. He looked at it, tilted his head, and smiled the slow, indulgent smile of a teacher about to demonstrate a lesson nobody asked for. The next moment, the fountain gurgled to life, not with water, but with red wine so fragrant that the bees became immediately intoxicated and fell into the stream in droves. The townspeople gasped, of course, they always did, but Dionysus only laughed, a sound like sunlight through a half-empty cup. "My dear friends," he said, "you've been celebrating wrong." This was not, to the elders' minds, the most diplomatic of openings. Yet there was something undeniably magnetic in the god's presence, that easy sway of motion, the way his eyes seemed to reflect every shade of the vineyard. He explained that mortals had forgotten the true spirit of joy. They worked, they worried, they measured, they obeyed the schedules of the sun and moon. But joy, he said, is not an appointment you keep, it's a wine you let breathe. The mayor, a sturdy woman named Callista, who had kept Mitika running through 3 droughts and 1 minor invasion, folded her arms. And what, precisely, she asked, does a god know of moderation? Dionysus blinked, as though she had asked him to explain arithmetic. Moderation, he said slowly, is just excess wearing a smaller toga. The villagers laughed nervously, unsure if this was wisdom or nonsense. The god took their laughter as consent. That evening, he announced, they would hold a feast of polite revelry. Everyone was to attend, even the goats if they behaved. What followed was perhaps the most carefully planned party in Greek history. The elders assigned seating charts. The priest arranged an altar at a safe distance from the wine supply. A local potter was asked to craft ceremonial cups in precisely equal sizes, to prevent what he called competitive intoxication. Everything was organized to within an olive pit's margin of error. But Dionysus, when he arrived at the feast, looked upon the neatly arranged tables and sighed. "This," he murmured, "is not celebration. This is paperwork with snacks." He sat anyway. The villagers watched, fascinated, as he lifted his cup, poured it out onto the ground, and said, "To the earth, who drinks more honestly than we do." The gesture was beautiful, if confusing. Within minutes, the guests began to imitate him, and the carefully measured amphorae began to empty far faster than the committee had predicted. Then came the singing, hesitant at first, then bold, then chaotic. Someone began drumming on a breadboard. Children ran between the tables with wreaths of ivy. The rules were forgotten, the wine was not. Through it all, Dionysus watched with an expression of deep, amused tenderness. "You see," he told Callista, who was still trying to maintain a semblance of order. "Joy is not something you plan, it's something you spill." By midnight, the square was alive with laughter. The fountain still ran crimson. Even the goats had joined, standing solemnly as if awaiting communion. Dionysus rose, arms outstretched, and declared, "Now, my friends, we are ready for the second lesson." The villagers, blinking through the haze of contentment, murmured in anticipation. What could possibly come next? More wine? A dance? A polite lecture about grape cultivation? Instead, Dionysus said, "Tomorrow we shall learn restraint." There was a silence, then a few uncertain chuckles. Surely, they thought, he was joking, but he wasn't smiling. The god of wine had just announced a seminar on self-control. It was the first recorded instance of collective confusion in a Dionysian festival. And it was only the beginning of the strangest moral education in all of myth. Morning came to Mitika with a surprising lack of dignity. The fountain still burbled faintly with the remnants of watered-down wine. The square smelled of crushed grapes, smoke, and the sort of optimism that seems reasonable only under the influence. A goat was asleep on the roof of the town hall. Somewhere nearby, a flute played a tune that sounded suspiciously like someone learning scales for the first time. The villagers woke slowly, nursing the mild ache of divine enthusiasm. Dionysus, of course, looked immaculate, his hair slightly tousled, his expression radiant, as if the sunrise had been invented just to illuminate him. He stood in the square, surrounded by a few faithful maenads who seemed equally untouched by mortal exhaustion. The townspeople gathered, clutching bread, water, and an assortment of excuses. "Good morning," Dionysus said, with the serene cheerfulness of a teacher addressing students after their first failed exam. Yesterday you learned joy, today you will learn restraint. They are two sides of the same grape. Callista, the mayor, squinted at him. Restraint? She repeated. After you turned our fountain into a tavern. The god smiled. Exactly. You now have something to restrain. This was not a popular announcement. Restraint, in the minds of the villagers, sounded uncomfortably like work, and they already had plenty of that. The bakers had loaves to sell, the farmers had tools to repair, and the shepherds had to find their missing goats, some of which were still meandering around in ivy wreaths. Yet Dionysus was not to be dissuaded. He declared that for the next day, the town would observe a festival of stillness. No singing, no dancing, no drinking, unless it was for hydration. The god's logic, if you could call it that, was simple. If you cannot sit quietly with joy, you do not truly possess it. It was, as one historian later noted, the earliest recorded mindfulness retreat in Western civilization, though without the benefit of comfortable cushions or herbal tea. The villagers tried to comply. They sat in their courtyards, staring at olive trees, attempting to feel the fullness of stillness. Some managed for a while, lulled by the hum of bees and the distant bleating of goats, but others found their thoughts drifting. One young man confessed later that he spent most of the time wondering if anyone would notice if he took a small sip of leftover wine, purely, of course, as an experiment in resisting temptation. Meanwhile, Dionysus wandered through the town like a patient but amused overseer. He offered occasional words of encouragement. Yes, breathe like a vineyard before rain, or you are the silence between two songs. The villagers nodded solemnly, though several admitted afterward that they had no idea what he meant. By midday, the heat had begun to rise, and tempers followed. Children complained. A potter dropped a jug and swore loudly, then apologized to the god. Callista, ever the realist, approached Dionysus and said, "Perhaps, great one, mortals are not meant for such contemplative restraint." Dionysus turned his gaze toward her, eyes half closed, as if listening to something far away. "Callista," he said gently, "you work so hard to hold your people together. But do you ever hold yourself still?" She hesitated. "I don't have that luxury." "Then you mistake luxury for necessity," he said. "Stillness is not an absence of work, it's the moment the earth inhales before the next harvest." Callista frowned, not in anger, but in thought. She looked around at her people, sitting awkwardly in their courtyards, struggling against boredom, and she realized how rare silence had become among them. It was true, the fields, the markets, even the evening meals were filled with chatter and effort. Rest was something they treated like theft, stealing moments between obligations. Perhaps there was something to learn here, even from a god who once turned sailors into dolphins for sport. Still, it was not easy. By late afternoon, half the village had quietly relocated to the shade of the olive groves, where they could at least whisper without being seen. The maenads, stationed at intervals around the town like divine sentinels of discipline, hummed low notes to keep the peace. It was, in its way, rather beautiful, an entire town wrapped in a blanket of enforced serenity, save for the occasional sound of a snoring goat or a jug being set down too hard. As dusk approached, Dionysus called everyone back to the square. The villagers, relieved to move again, gathered around the fountain, now filled once more with water, or at least something close to water. The god climbed onto the base of the statue of Hermes, who was notably absent, perhaps wisely, and addressed the crowd. "My dear mortals," he began, "today you have proven that silence is more difficult than song, but that is why it is precious. Joy without pause is merely noise, silence without joy is despair. You must learn to let them breathe together." He paused, surveying their faces, tired, sunburnt, but attentive. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall learn balance." A collective groan rose from the crowd. The gods, it seemed, had a limitless supply of lessons, while mortals had only so much patience. But Dionysus smiled, unconcerned. "Balance," he said, "is the art of pouring without spilling." That evening, as twilight bled gently into night, the villagers returned to their homes. The air smelled faintly of honey and smoke, cicadas began their endless rhythm. Callista lingered in the square, watching the god sip quietly from a cup, his gaze fixed on the stars. She approached him, her voice low. "You teach joy, and now restraint. But why us? Why this little town?" Dionysus looked at her, and for the first time his expression softened into something almost mortal, a trace of melancholy beneath the playfulness. "Because," he said, "the great cities no longer listen. They think they already know how to celebrate. But here, in your quiet fields, people still remember that laughter and prayer share the same breath." Callista considered this, though she could not tell if it was wisdom or poetry or both. She thanked him and left him to his thoughts. Later that night, when the moon was high, something peculiar happened. A faint mist rose from the vineyards, curling like incense around the rooftops. The townspeople, half asleep, thought they heard music, soft, distant, almost like the echo of their laughter from the night before. And for a brief moment, Mitika seemed suspended between wakefulness and dream, between silence and song. The next morning, Dionysus would unveil his final lesson, the most unexpected of all. But even gods, it seems, must wait for the right rhythm to continue their symphony. Would his last teaching bring wisdom, chaos, or both? And could mortals truly learn to party politely, without losing the spirit of celebration altogether? When the third morning came, the people of Mitika rose quietly. There was no trumpet of divine arrival, no procession of dancers, only the soft rustle of vines in the breeze and the faint scent of last night's embers. The village felt different, not sober exactly, but slower, as if the air itself had decided to rest its elbows on the windowsills. Dionysus for once was awake early. He sat by the now clear fountain, barefoot, tracing idle patterns in the dust with a stick of vinewood. His maenads stood at a respectful distance, unusually subdued. Perhaps even gods, he thought, could appreciate a morning of calm after days of mortal enthusiasm. Callista found him there. The mayor carried herself with her usual authority, though her voice was softer than before. "Great Dionysus," she said, "the people are wondering what lesson awaits them today. You promised balance. I fear they may take it to mean more chores." The god smiled faintly. "No, my dear Callista. Today, we finish our education." And then, he glanced toward the horizon, where the hills shimmered in the sun. "I will leave you to your own celebrations, polite or otherwise." She nodded, relieved, and perhaps a little sad. For all the confusion he had caused, the god had brought a strange sort of harmony to Mitika, even if only by accident. When the sun was high, Dionysus gathered the villagers once more. This time, there was no grand altar, no elaborate feast, just a circle drawn in the dust of the square, large enough for everyone to stand around it. The god motioned for silence, and when the last whisper faded, he spoke. "Joy without measure becomes madness," he began. "Restraint without warmth becomes stone. But between them lies a narrow path, where you may drink, and laugh, and still remember the taste of water." He gestured to the fountain. Clear water flowed there now, shimmering in the light. "Today," he said, "you will share one cup, passed from hand to hand. You will drink, not to forget, but to remember. Each sip is a promise that joy and stillness will take turns in your hearts. It sounded simple enough, but simplicity, as the Greeks often discovered, can be exhausting. The cup was brought forward, a plain clay vessel, slightly chipped, made by the village potter. Dionysus filled it himself, not with wine this time, but with a mixture of wine and water in equal measure. Half memory, half clarity, he said. Balance. The villagers hesitated. They had learned to expect surprises from divine rituals. But when the first man took a sip, nothing unusual happened. No transformation, no ecstatic trance, only the taste, smooth, mild, faintly sweet. He smiled and passed it to the next. One by one, the people of Mytica shared the cup. Some drank deeply, others barely wet their lips. A few whispered blessings. Children, too young for wine, dipped their fingers and laughed at the chill. And as the cup made its slow journey around the circle, something curious began to happen. The chatter softened, the laughter grew quiet, then deep, not the raucous laughter of the first feast, but something warmer, steadier. People looked at each other, truly looked, perhaps for the first time in years. The baker noticed the farmer's sunburned hands, the shepherd saw the potter's cracked fingernails. Even Callista allowed herself to smile without reservation. It was as if the entire town had taken one long shared breath. Dionysus watched, saying nothing. The god who had brought madness and ecstasy to countless cities stood perfectly still, content to let mortals discover what he had known all along. That joy, to endure, must sometimes move at the pace of conversation. When the cup came back to him, empty, he turned it over and set it gently on the ground. "There," he said, "that is how you celebrate politely, not by dulling joy, but by giving it rhythm." The villagers applauded softly, uncertain whether this marked the end of the festival or the beginning of another. Dionysus smiled, his eyes half-lidded as if he were already halfway to sleep himself. "You have learned more quickly than most," he said. "Even the Athenians never managed this part." He looked to Callista. "Keep your fountain flowing, but let it be water by day, and wine only when the moon insists. Tell your children that joy is not in the cup, but in the company that passes it." Then, as the afternoon light stretched long and golden across the square, the god stood and brushed the dust from his feet. The Maenads gathered behind him, still humming softly, a melody both mournful and sweet. Without ceremony he began to walk away, taking the narrow goat path that had brought him there. "Will you return next year?" someone called. He paused. "If you keep your promises," he said, "I will not need to." And with that he was gone. The weeks that followed were almost disappointingly ordinary. The fountain returned to its usual clarity. The vineyards ripened without divine interference. The goats came down from the rooftops. But something subtle had changed in Mytica. The villagers still worked, still argued, still worried about the weather, yet they moved with a little more gentleness. Meals lingered longer. Songs were sung without haste. When they drank, they did so slowly, savoring not the wine, but the silence between words. It is said that in later years, when travelers passed through Mytica, they found the people unusually calm, cheerful, but never frantic. They celebrated often, but never excessively. A few skeptical historians dismissed this as legend, claiming no small town could remain peaceful for more than a generation. Yet those who visited swore that even the goats seemed well-mannered. As for Dionysus, his cult spread across the land, sometimes wild, sometimes violent, always unpredictable. But in a handful of places, quiet villages like Mytica, his festivals took on a different tone. Calm processions, songs sung softly, cups shared rather than emptied. These were known as the Feasts of Balance. Scholars argue that they may have influenced later Greek symposiums, gatherings where conversation and moderation were held as high virtues as the wine itself. In that sense, Dionysus's lesson endured far longer than anyone expected. A god of chaos had, in his roundabout way, become a teacher of harmony. Perhaps he understood better than most that joy, like wine, must be allowed to breathe, but not left open too long lest it sour. Centuries later, when archaeologists dug through what remained of Mytica's ancient square, they found fragments of a small clay cup, its surface faintly stained red. An inscription, barely legible, read, "To the God who taught us to drink slowly." A quiet sentiment, and a fitting legacy for a town that once learned how to party politely. In the end, perhaps that is the secret of civilization itself, not in the noise of celebration or the silence of restraint, but in the rhythm between them. And maybe, somewhere, Dionysus still smiles when mortals remember to raise their cups thoughtfully, rather than desperately. Imagine a time long before streets were paved, before city walls became symbols of power, before markets overflowed with goods from distant lands. Athens, in its early days, was a modest settlement perched atop a rocky hill. Its people tilled the soil, tended small herds, and prayed to deities who seemed as much neighbors as distant rulers. Among these gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, craft, and strategic warfare, held a particular fascination with the city. She did not merely observe its growth from Mount Olympus, she cared deeply, even insistently, about its direction. According to tradition, the city had yet to be named. Its residents were in heated debate over whether the settlement should bear the favor of Athena or Poseidon, the god of the sea, who also claimed to have a stake in its future. A council was called on the rocky plateau where the Acropolis would later stand, an informal gathering of elders, farmers, and occasional travelers who had wandered in from surrounding hamlets. The contest itself, as decreed by Zeus, was simple yet profound. Each god would offer a gift to the city. The citizens would decide which gift was superior, and the victor's name would grace the city. Poseidon struck first. He raised his trident, a tool of awe, and touched the ground near the summit. Instantly, a spring of water gushed forth, sparkling with uncanny clarity. It was salt water, warm to the touch, as if drawn from the sea itself. The crowd murmured. Farmers and herders were polite travelers, tilted their heads, impressed. Some wondered if a seawater spring might one day allow Athens to dominate trade by boat. Others, more practical, noticed the immediate impracticality. Crops could not drink salt water, and livestock did not favor briny pools. Then Athena stepped forward. She paused, considering her approach. She had no trident, she had no earthquakes to summon. What she did have was strategy, the kind of methodical, long-sighted cunning for which she would later be revered. She knelt beside a particularly barren patch of soil near the Acropolis. From her hands she pulled a small branch, delicate and slightly twisted, and pressed it into the earth. When she withdrew it, the ground quivered, and from the soil sprang a small twisted tree, the first olive tree in the region. Its leaves shimmered with silvery green, its branches sturdy yet elegant, and the air around it smelled faintly of the warmth of the sun. The crowd gasped. Farmers leaned forward, travelers muttered approval. The olive tree, Athena explained, was more than a plant. Its fruit would provide food, oil for cooking, oil for lamps, and wood for tools. Unlike Poseidon's saltwater spring, which might flood fields or wither crops, the olive tree would sustain life in countless ways. Athena, calmly yet firmly, laid out her reasoning. This tree feeds, it illuminates, it heals, it fortifies. It is not merely a gift, it is a foundation. Poseidon, to be fair, had not expected subtlety. He stomped his trident once on the ground, sending a ripple through the salt spring. "Water is life, he bellowed. "It moves ships, it quenches thirst, it gives you power." Athena, with her usual composure, did not flinch. She gestured toward the olive sapling. "Life is more than thirst, Poseidon. It is sustenance, patience, and wisdom applied over time. This tree will endure when your waters recede. The debate, naturally, did not end there. Some villagers argued for the immediate utility of water, others were swayed by the promise of long-term stability. The elders convened for a protracted discussion that would last days, in truth, weeks, filled with back-and-forth deliberation, minor quarrels, and a surprising amount of attention paid to whether goats preferred olive leaves or branches of other shrubs. As the council dragged on, Athena did not grow impatient. She quietly tended the olive sapling, ensuring its roots sank firmly into the rocky soil. She pruned its smallest branches, adjusted the angle of its leaves to catch the sun, and whispered softly to the tree, instructions, encouragement, perhaps even subtle guidance on the art of photosynthesis, if one believed the stories. Over time, the sapling grew sturdier, a quiet testament to diligence and care. Poseidon, meanwhile, seemed increasingly frustrated. His water spring shimmered in the sun, occasionally sloshing into unwanted channels, flooding the feet of curious onlookers. Fishermen found it interesting, if slightly confusing, but farmers continued to grumble. The salt water could not irrigate fields, it could not nourish olive groves, and worst of all, it began to smell faintly of seaweed under the midday sun. In response, Athena made her next move. She harvested a small number of olives from the new tree, barely more than a handful, but enough to demonstrate her point. With skillful fingers, she crushed the fruit into oil, filling a tiny bowl. She held it up to the sun, and the villagers saw a golden liquid that seemed to shimmer with sunlight itself. "Observe," Athena said, "the potential of this gift. It nourishes, it illuminates your homes, it anoints your bodies. In short, it solves problems you have not yet imagined." The villagers, even the skeptics, were intrigued. One elder, who had been leaning toward Poseidon, touched the oil cautiously. A single drop on his hand smelled faintly of grass, faintly of sun-warmed soil, faintly of the tree itself. He nodded slowly. "Perhaps," he murmured, "she has a point." Poseidon, now visibly annoyed, tried to counter with a demonstration of waves crashing against the hills, raising his trident in theatrical protest. The water moved, it splashed, but it caused little more than dampened robes and a few irritated goats. The crowd laughed nervously, uncertain whether to celebrate the display or retreat from the mess. Athena, in contrast, simply poured a small amount of olive oil into the grooves of a clay lamp. She lit it with a twig, and a steady flame arose, illuminating the faces of everyone in the square. The symbolism was not lost on the villagers. While Poseidon's gift offered immediate spectacle, Athena's tree offered enduring utility, quiet wisdom, and practical solutions. By the third day, the elders reached a conclusion. They unanimously, though some grudgingly, awarded the city to Athena. Poseidon grumbled about missed opportunities and impractical mortals, but eventually, with a final flourish of his trident, he withdrew to the sea. The olive tree remained. It was planted on the highest point of the Acropolis, where it would grow for centuries, a silent witness to the lives of generations of Athenians. Yet even as Athena was celebrated, there was an unresolved tension. Winning the city's favor was one thing, teaching humans to make use of her gift was another. Many villagers were unfamiliar with cultivating olives, pressing oil, or recognizing the subtleties that distinguished a fine harvest from a poor one. Would they, the elders wondered, be able to honor her gift properly? Or would the olive tree, a symbol of wisdom, remain just a curious plant atop a hill, admired but unused? Athena, as always, observed quietly. Her victory in the debate was clear, but imparting practical knowledge would require more patience than most gods were willing to spare. She would have to teach the villagers not only the use of the olive, but also the slow rhythm of care, the gentle persistence of tending a tree season after season, the subtle skill of producing oil that nourished both body and mind. And so, as the sun dipped low on the third evening, Athena's victory felt both complete and tentative. The city had a name, the gift had been accepted, yet a far more enduring challenge waited. Could mortals, with all their distractions, truly learned to live wisely alongside the blessing of the olive tree? The answer, like the sapling itself, was still growing. The first lesson Athena offered the Athenians after her victory was subtle, almost imperceptible. She did not arrive with proclamations or divine spectacles, nor did she command armies or rain blessings in obvious ways. Instead, she wandered quietly among the villagers, observing their routines, noting which fields were well tended and which orchards were neglected. Her gaze fell upon the olive sapling she had planted atop the Acropolis, now slightly taller and sturdier than it had been during the contest, and she seemed satisfied. The tree itself, it appeared, was her silent student, responding to the care of the earth and the attentions of human hands. Athena understood, however, that planting a tree was only the beginning. The greater challenge was to teach mortals the wisdom of nurturing it, and the humility required to respect its rhythms. The villagers, accustomed to immediate results in daily toil, found the pace of olive cultivation unexpectedly tedious. The process involved planting, pruning, watering, protecting from pests, and eventually harvesting, each step requiring patience and diligence, neither of which came naturally to a society used to more straightforward labors. To facilitate learning, Athena convened a small group of villagers near the tree. She selected individuals who displayed curiosity, patience, and a willingness to observe. One was Callias, a young man with a penchant for careful record-keeping. Another was Lyra, a woman whose hands were skilled in weaving, but who had little experience with farming. And the third was Dorian, a skeptical elder who had still not fully accepted the olive tree's superiority over Poseidon's spring. "Observe," Athena began. "The olive does not demand obedience as your crops do. It is not hurried by the sun, nor driven by fear of frost. Its growth is deliberate, deliberate as thought itself. Your care must match this rhythm." She showed them the proper method of pruning small branches to encourage fruiting. Each cut, she explained, was a deliberate choice. Too much, and the tree would weaken; too little, and it would stagnate. Callias took meticulous notes, drawing diagrams in the dust with a stick. Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she followed Athena's demonstration, but she felt a surprising calm in the repetitive motion. Even Dorian, ever skeptical, began to nod, observing the subtle change in the tree's branches after careful pruning. Athena also emphasized soil preparation, the subtle art of turning earth without disturbing the roots, and the importance of sunlight and spacing. The villagers discovered that the olive tree required thought as much as labor, a balance of practical care and intuitive attention. Athena, with a gentle smile, suggested small daily rituals, checking the tree at sunrise, whispering encouragement to it, observing the insects that visited. These routines, she said, were more than superstition, they were the tools of patience. The first challenge arose in harvesting. The villagers were unfamiliar with the timing. Too early, and the fruit would be bitter; too late, and it would spoil. Athena guided them through their first picking season with precision, teaching them to test olives for softness and aroma, and to handle the fruit gently to avoid bruising. She demonstrated how to press the olives to extract oil, explaining the qualities of a good yield: clarity, aroma, and smoothness. For the first time, the Athenians observed that the labor of tending a tree produced a reward that required skill and observation, not just effort. As the villagers worked, Athena quietly shared practical lessons intertwined with moral and intellectual guidance. She explained the symbolism of the olive tree, emphasizing moderation, balance, and endurance, virtues that mirrored the lessons of civic life. She showed how olive oil could be used for cooking, lighting, personal hygiene, and even medicine, connecting each use to daily life and communal well-being. The villagers, initially skeptical, gradually recognized that the gift they had received was not merely symbolic, but practical and multifaceted. Yet the process was far from smooth. Some villagers grew impatient with the slow pace of the tree's growth. Others struggled to replicate Athena's techniques accurately. The most common complaint was the monotony of tending the tree, a labor that, unlike harvesting grain or tending animals, yielded no immediate gratification. Athena responded with quiet encouragement, reminding the villagers that wisdom, like the olive tree, flourishes over time. "It is in your restraint and care," she explained, "that the tree rewards you. Haste spoils both fruit and understanding." Over the months, the villagers began to internalize the lesson. They observed patterns in the tree's growth, understood the relationship between pruning and fruit yield, and learned to anticipate seasonal changes. Even those initially doubtful, like Dorian, began to see the olive tree as a teacher rather than a passive object. Its slow and deliberate development mirrored the human virtues Athena valued: patience, attentiveness, and the ability to foresee long-term consequences. Athena also introduced the Athenians to the broader cultural significance of the olive tree. She explained that olive oil could be traded, forming the basis of commerce. It could be offered as tribute, cementing alliances, and it could even be used in ritual ceremonies, linking the practical with the spiritual. The villagers realized that the olive tree, though modest in appearance, was a linchpin of societal growth. Through its care, they were learning not only agricultural techniques, but also the foundational principles of civic life. By winter, the first small harvest of olives had been pressed into oil. The villagers, who had once been skeptical of Athena's gift, now handled the golden liquid with reverence. Its aroma filled the homes, its taste enhanced their food, and its light illuminated their evenings. Athena watched quietly, satisfied. The lesson in patience, practical skill, and civic virtue had taken root alongside the sapling. Even so, an unresolved question lingered. Would future generations continue to honor the tree with the same dedication? Athena had taught the first generation carefully, but humans are prone to forgetfulness, distraction, and impatience. She knew that without continual care, the tree might be neglected, its wisdom lost, and the city might again face choices without understanding the consequences. Would the lessons of patience, foresight, and balance endure long enough to shape the character of Athens? Or would the tree become merely a decorative relic, admired but unheeded, while the lessons it embodied faded from memory? Athena's gaze lingered on the olive tree as the sun set, casting long shadows across the Acropolis. She understood that teaching humans was a far more delicate and uncertain enterprise than winning a contest. The tree itself was thriving, but the ultimate success depended on the mortals who lived beside it. Their willingness to learn, to observe, and to care would determine whether her gift became the cornerstone of the city's identity or a forgotten curiosity. And so, as night fell over early Athens, the goddess of wisdom pondered her next steps. The city had accepted her gift, the sapling had been nurtured, and yet the question remained: could she instill the depth of understanding required for the olive tree to truly shape the culture of Athens? The answer, like the slow growth of the tree itself, would take time to reveal. The years that followed Athena's introduction of the olive tree to Athens were quieter than the dramatic contest that had brought her victory. The city began to grow around the Acropolis, its streets and homes developing slowly, like a painting coming to life brushstroke by careful brushstroke. And throughout this period of human diligence, the olive tree stood as a constant, its silvery leaves glinting in the sun, a living reminder of divine instruction and the practical wisdom embedded in seemingly ordinary labor. Athena, for her part, remained a patient observer. She did not intervene unless necessary, allowing the Athenians to manage the cultivation and care themselves. Her lesson, she knew, was not merely about the tree or its oil. It was about human resilience, foresight, and the capacity for reasoned action. Every pruning, every press of olives, every careful measurement of water and sunlight became a small exercise in disciplined judgment. These mundane acts, repeated over decades, formed a pattern that would quietly shape Athenian society. The villagers themselves discovered subtle joys in the olive tree's routines. Children learned to recognize the first swelling of fruit, the gentle bend of branches under the weight of harvest, the sound of oil dripping into a clay press. Farmers developed meticulous calendars to track the tree's growth, adjusting care according to the seasons. Even skeptics, those who had initially questioned Athena's choice, found satisfaction in the predictable yet evolving cycles of cultivation. Life itself seemed to expand in parallel with the growth of the tree, deliberate, patient, and quietly rewarding. Trade soon followed. The small quantities of olive oil produced by the early Athenians were sufficient to attract attention from neighboring towns. Villagers who once struggled to envision the broader significance of their work now discovered that their careful labor could create connections beyond the hills surrounding Athens. Olive oil became a commodity, a tool of diplomacy, and a mark of civic pride. In each transaction, the values Athena had imparted, foresight, moderation, attention to detail, traveled with the liquid gold, embedding themselves in a network of relationships that extended far beyond the city's borders. Ritual life, too, embraced the olive tree. Priests and priestesses incorporated its oil into ceremonies, using it to anoint leaders, bless meals, and illuminate sacred spaces. In each ritual, mortals and divinities alike recognized the dual purpose of the gift, practical sustenance and spiritual symbolism. Athena's wisdom had become tangible, accessible, and interwoven with daily life, yet subtle enough that it did not impose itself as coercive authority. The olive tree, standing atop the Acropolis, was both teacher and emblem, a living lesson in patience, resourcefulness, and the integration of intellect with action. Over time, the practice of cultivating olives became a defining feature of Athenian identity. Citizens took pride in the meticulous care required, understanding that the discipline of tending a tree reflected the discipline of civic life. City leaders cited the olive as a model for governance. Decisions should be deliberate, carefully considered, and rooted in observation and foresight. Families passed down knowledge from one generation to the next, embedding Athena's lesson in both craft and culture. The tree itself matured slowly, its branches thickening, its leaves taking on a darker, more enduring sheen. It was, in essence, a witness to the formation of a city. Yet the story was not without its minor mishaps. Some harvests were disappointing due to poor weather, occasional pests destroyed part of a crop, and every few decades, human negligence threatened the tree's survival. Each challenge became an opportunity for learning. Villagers adapted, innovated, and experimented with new cultivation techniques. Athena's original lesson, that wisdom required patience, observation, and careful effort, endured not only because of her divine insight, but because humans repeatedly faced consequences that demanded they internalize it. Legends grew around the olive tree as well. Poets composed verses praising the fruit, its oil, and its divine origin. Philosophers referenced it as a metaphor for reason, virtue, and moderation. Athenians came to see the tree not merely as a plant, but as a touchstone for thoughtful living. Its branches were symbols of victory in athletic contests, of peace in diplomacy, and of enduring effort in civic responsibility. In every context, the olive tree carried Athena's lesson forward, quietly shaping cultural norms and societal expectations. Athena herself rarely appeared again in person. When she did, her presence was subtle, often manifesting as guidance through dreams or gentle whispers of insight. She had taught the first generation the value of care and reason. Now it was up to mortals to carry that knowledge forward. In this way, her victory in the contest became more than a symbolic triumph. It evolved into a practical, long-term influence on the development of the city. The tree was a living testament to human diligence guided by divine foresight. The greatest impact of the olive tree, however, was in the way it shaped collective thought. Citizens began to understand that significant change often required incremental effort. They recognized that patience and persistence could yield rewards far exceeding immediate gratification. They internalized the principle that wisdom was not a single decisive act, but a series of attentive choices repeated over time. Athena had, in effect, designed a curriculum without words, using a tree as both teacher and text. Centuries later, when Athens became a center of philosophy, politics, and culture, historians looked back on these early lessons and recognized their subtle but profound influence. The care of olive groves, the preparation of oil, and the structured cultivation of land had fostered habits of observation, deliberation, and civic responsibility that underpinned the city's later achievements. Athena's simple act of planting an olive tree had initiated a chain of practices and values that contributed to the identity of an entire civilization. Even in the present day, the olive tree remains emblematic of Athens, of Greece, and of the enduring power of thoughtful cultivation. Its fruit continues to nourish bodies, its oil lights homes, and its symbolism teaches patience, resilience, and the quiet rewards of long-term planning. Athena's wisdom, transmitted through the deliberate care of a humble tree, persists as a reminder that even small, seemingly mundane acts can have transformative effects when guided by foresight and understanding. And so the story concludes with a reflection. A god's victory in a debate may appear fleeting, but the true measure of influence lies in the slow, steady imprint left on human lives. Athena's olive tree did more than win her a city. It taught generations the value of patience, the necessity of careful attention, and the profound impact of practical wisdom applied over time. The challenge she left behind remained subtle yet enduring. Would humans continue to tend the gifts of the gods wisely, or allow them to be forgotten in the rush of daily life? The answer, as ever, was in their hands, and in the quiet, deliberate growth of a small tree that had begun as a simple argument between deities. In the end, wisdom, like olive oil, requires patient extraction. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson Athena ever taught Athens, that the slow, careful work of tending what is good may shape history more effectively than grand gestures, loud proclamations, or the fleeting triumph of debate. Hermes, the fleet-footed god of travelers, thieves, and messengers, had many talents, but one of his lesser-known preoccupations was footwear. In the early days of Olympus, before the popularity of winged sandals, Hermes noticed that mortals frequently complained about sore feet. Their roads were uneven, their cobblestones jagged, and their journeys long. Travelers limped, merchants staggered under their loads, and even herdsmen occasionally cursed in ways that offended the local deities. Hermes, ever the problem solver, decided to intervene. The god was inspired by necessity. Messages had to be delivered swiftly. Mistakes could prove costly, even deadly. If mortal feet were slow, the efficiency of divine communication was compromised. Hermes first attempted to accelerate walking through minor blessings, smooth stones, helpful breezes, even brief bursts of wind at one's back, but these proved inconsistent. Travelers reported feeling suddenly lighter, only to stumble awkwardly when the gusts died. The god realized a more reliable solution was needed, a sandal that would make humans more comfortable and perhaps a little faster on their feet. Hermes gathered materials from the hills and valleys surrounding Mount Olympus, soft leather, woven reeds, and cordage that could be twisted into straps. He experimented with simple designs, testing them on small rocks and slippery slopes. His first attempts were less than ideal. Some sandals twisted, others caused blisters, and one particularly disastrous version left its wearer with soles so sticky that he could not release his feet from the ground without jumping. Hermes noted each failure meticulously, scribbling observations in a small notebook he carried for just such purposes. He referred to these as performance metrics, though the term itself had not yet been coined. Curiously, the god of travelers treated the project like a series of controlled experiments. He enlisted mortals as test subjects, offering small gifts of wine or figs in exchange for their cooperation. The villagers were skeptical at first. Why would a god care about their feet? And yet Hermes' manner was charming, insistent but polite, persuasive without overwhelming authority. You will not only improve your comfort, he explained, but also contribute to the advancement of civilization, and perhaps earn a divine story to tell your grandchildren. The early trials were chaotic. Some sandals fell apart after a few hours of walking, others caused odd slipping motions that led to mild collisions. Hermes catalogued these outcomes with meticulous detail, noting the tensile strength of straps, the elasticity of leather, and the friction of various surfaces. He was particularly fascinated by the interaction between human gait and the sole's curvature. The foot is a remarkable tool, he muttered to himself, but humans do not appreciate its subtlety until it is guided by design. Despite the setbacks, progress was gradual. Hermes introduced small innovations, reinforced straps for stability, cushioned soles for comfort, and lightweight materials to reduce fatigue. Mortals began to notice improvement. A messenger who had been hobbled for months due to calluses reported that his feet felt almost divine. Others were more cautious, noting the occasional tripping hazard or unusual squeak caused by leather rubbing against the ankle. Hermes documented each observation, revising his prototypes nightly. The god also understood the social implications of footwear. He observed that many travelers' complaints stemmed not only from discomfort but from inefficiency in walking and carrying goods. He hypothesized that a better sandal could influence trade, travel, and communication across the Greek world. If messages could be delivered with less physical strain, he reasoned, cities could coordinate more effectively, merchants could expand their markets, and even armies might march more reliably. The implications, he realized, were extensive, and the potential for recognition among mortals was delightful. One afternoon, Hermes invited a small group of villagers to participate in what he called the Great Field Test. They were instructed to walk from the base of a hill to the town's edge, carrying small bundles of goods. Hermes observed carefully, taking notes on stride, balance, and speed. Some mortals stumbled, others adapted quickly. He made minor adjustments, shortening straps here, widening soles there, smoothing edges to prevent blisters. At one point, a young boy lost his sandal entirely, and Hermes had to improvise a replacement using leaves and thin twine. The experiment continued until the sun was low, and the participants' endurance was tested in ways both practical and mildly humorous. By evening, the villagers had learned to appreciate Hermes's diligence. They began sharing stories of how the new sandals made long walks easier, though still imperfect. "The god may be meddlesome," an elder noted, "but at least our feet no longer hurt as much." Hermes smiled quietly, aware that such modest praise was a victory in itself. The sandals were not yet perfect, but the concept was taking hold. Human comfort, divine guidance, and careful observation could combine to create practical innovation. Hermes' interest did not end with comfort alone. He began experimenting with additional features: waterproofing for rainy paths, reinforced soles for rocky terrain, and decorative touches for ceremonial occasions. Each innovation was tested meticulously, with Hermes recording the results, observing how different ages, weights, and gait patterns influenced performance. Mortals participated willingly, curious to see whether divine ingenuity could actually improve their daily lives. By the end of the first season, Hermes had developed a version of the sandal that was remarkably functional. It supported long treks, protected against the rough terrain of Greece, and allowed even the heaviest travelers to maintain relatively steady pace. The god was satisfied, though being Hermes, he understood that perfection was never final. Minor improvements, he knew, would be needed with each generation of wearers. Human feet were, after all, diverse and unpredictable. Yet even as Hermes celebrated his success, he recognized an unresolved challenge. Mortals, unlike gods, did not always follow instructions carefully. Some would lace the straps incorrectly, others would neglect maintenance, and still others would misplace or lose their sandals entirely. The greatest invention could fail if humans failed to understand or respect it. Could these practical lessons in footwear truly endure among mortals, or would the sandals become a temporary curiosity, admired briefly and then forgotten? Hermes reflected on this as he walked along a ridge overlooking the village. The sun cast long shadows over the fields, and the first stars began to glimmer faintly in the evening sky. He realized that invention, even divine invention, was only part of the equation. Education, careful guidance, and repeated practice were equally important. The sandals themselves were a tool, but the human habits surrounding their use determined whether the innovation would last. And so, the great sandal-making experiment had achieved initial success, yet the true test lay ahead. Could mortals adopt the lessons of comfort, practicality, and diligence into their daily routines? Could a simple improvement to their feet ripple outward, affecting travel, commerce, and the flow of information across Greece? The answers were uncertain, but Hermes, as always, remained patient. After all, the god of messengers knew better than anyone that even the fastest traveler could only move as far as their feet would carry them, and those feet, if properly cared for, might one day carry civilization itself. The following weeks were devoted to refinement. Hermes, unlike many deities who preferred grand gestures, approached innovation with meticulous patience. The first version of the sandal had worked, but he was unsatisfied. There were minor complaints: straps chafed in unexpected ways, the soles were occasionally slippery on damp stones, and the design did not accommodate the diverse needs of all travelers. Each imperfection, he concluded, was an opportunity for observation and improvement. Hermes organized daily trials along various terrains. Gravel paths, riverbanks, hillsides, and sandy stretches were all included. He recruited a variety of villagers, messengers accustomed to carrying heavy bundles, herders accustomed to running across uneven fields, and even a few children to test light-footed agility. Observing how each wearer interacted with the sandal revealed subtleties Hermes had not anticipated. For example, a slight inward tilt of the sole improved balance on steep inclines, while a thinner strap near the heel reduced blisters on longer treks. Each adjustment required careful documentation, and Hermes maintained a ledger of notes, sketches, and small clay samples to test new materials. By midweek, Hermes began experimenting with padding. Mortals had noted soreness even when the leather was soft, and he realized that cushioning was not only about comfort, but also about endurance. He lined the inner sole with a layer of woven reeds, which absorbed impact while remaining flexible. He tested the padding on long treks, observing how it affected stride length, speed, and overall fatigue. Villagers remarked on the difference immediately. "I can walk farther," one young messenger exclaimed, "and still have strength to deliver my message, Ola." Hermes noted each reaction, delighted that a small innovation could have such practical consequences. Another critical consideration was the durability of the sandal. Early models showed wear after only a few weeks of rigorous testing. Hermes experimented with different tanning techniques, discovering that a combination of sun and herbal oils produced leather that was both supple and resistant to moisture. He incorporated braided straps, which allowed for slight stretching without breaking. The adjustments were subtle but cumulative. By the end of the month, the sandals were stronger, more comfortable, and more reliable than their predecessors. Hermes also considered aesthetics, though in his mind this was secondary to function. A sandal that was pleasing to the eye, he reasoned, would encourage consistent use. He added modest decorative etchings along the straps and subtle embossing on the soles. While the villagers were amused by these flourishes, they appreciated the added elegance. Even small enhancements could inspire pride, which Hermes understood as an essential component of habit formation. After all, a worn but cared-for sandal symbolized not only comfort, but also attention to one's own life and labor. In addition to practical adjustments, Hermes began teaching villagers about maintenance. Leather, he explained, required regular cleaning, oiling, and careful storage. Ignoring these steps could shorten the lifespan of even the most well-crafted sandal. He demonstrated techniques for stretching straps without damage, for smoothing rough edges, and for repairing minor tears. Mortals absorbed these lessons with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some found joy in the meticulous care, others grumbled at the added responsibility. Hermes, patient as ever, encouraged repeated practice, emphasizing that diligence was part of the benefit. "A sandal cared for is a messenger preserved," he said. Hermes' attention extended beyond footwear mechanics to human movement itself. He observed gait, stride length, and posture, noting how the design of the sandal influenced balance and energy expenditure. Some villagers naturally walked more efficiently than others, some overcompensated with awkward foot motion. Hermes made minor adjustments, arch support here, sole curvature there, to harmonize the interaction between human anatomy and the sandal's design. This level of detail, he knew, would ensure that the sandals truly enhanced the capabilities of their wearers rather than simply providing cosmetic improvement. The god also experimented with different materials sourced from surrounding regions. Leather from goats in nearby hills was supple, and light reeds from riversides were springy and resilient. Wool padding from local flocks provided insulation during colder months. Hermes learned to combine these elements in ways that optimized performance for varying conditions. Travelers on mountain paths appreciated the insulation, messengers on hot roads valued breathability, herders navigating damp fields relied on traction-enhanced soles. By integrating local resources into his designs, Hermes ensured that his invention was not only effective but also sustainable and context-sensitive. By the end of these trials, the villagers began noticing subtle but significant changes in their daily lives. Messages were delivered faster, journeys took less physical toll, and even minor errands felt easier. The sandals did not guarantee speed or safety, but they reduced the friction of travel in both literal and figurative senses. Hermes observed this quietly, noting that the true success of his experiment was not the sandal itself, but the ripple effect it created, a community moving more efficiently, more thoughtfully, and with greater awareness of how small improvements could accumulate over time. Despite these successes, an unresolved concern remained. Would mortals continue to use and care for the sandals correctly? Innovation, Hermes knew, was only valuable if its benefits endured. Humans were prone to neglect, shortcuts, and inconsistency. If future wearers disregarded maintenance or reverted to old habits, the improvements could be lost. The god understood that his role was not only to invent but also to cultivate habit and appreciation, a subtle lesson in responsibility that extended beyond footwear. One afternoon, as Hermes observed a group of villagers testing the latest sandal iteration, he noticed a young boy skipping carelessly across a stony path. One strap had begun to loosen, and the sole was bending unnaturally. Hermes approached and knelt beside him, demonstrating how to retie the strap securely, smooth the leather, and adjust the fit. The boy's eyes widened as he realized that careful attention made walking easier, safer, and more pleasant. Hermes smiled to himself. This was the essence of his teaching. The sandals were not merely objects, they were tools for learning patience, attentiveness, and the consequences of deliberate action. As night fell, Hermes retreated to a quiet hillside, reflecting on the progress of his experiment. The sandals were close to perfect, yet he knew perfection was not the goal. Their purpose was to cultivate awareness, improve efficiency, and foster small habits of care, lessons that could extend far beyond the village paths and rocky slopes. Even as a god, he recognized that the effectiveness of his invention relied on the mortals who wore it and the diligence they exercised. The ultimate success, he realized, was less about footwear and more about human behavior. And so, as stars began to glimmer above the hills, Hermes considered the next step. Could mortals integrate these lessons into daily life? Could the sandals inspire broader improvements in travel, communication, and civic coordination? The answers were uncertain, and that uncertainty was, in itself, a critical part of the experiment. The journey toward lasting impact, Hermes understood, was ongoing, as deliberate, patient, and measured as the perfect stride. The god of messengers knew one thing for certain: when humans walked thoughtfully, with care and awareness, they carried more than themselves. They carried efficiency, connection, and the subtle imprint of divine insight. And that, he concluded, was perhaps the most important innovation of all. By the time the first harvest of sandals was completed, the small village that had participated in Hermes's experiment was transformed in subtle but significant ways. The villagers moved more efficiently along the rocky roads, messages reached neighboring settlements more reliably, and journeys that had once been exhausting were now completed with relative ease. The sandals, carefully refined through weeks of trial and observation, had achieved their immediate practical purpose. Yet Hermes, ever thoughtful, understood that the lasting impact of his work extended beyond mere comfort or speed. The god began observing broader social effects. Merchants who had struggled to transport goods across uneven paths discovered that the improved sandals allowed them to carry heavier loads without fatigue. Farmers attending distant markets could return home without crippling soreness, and traders began traveling to new regions they had previously avoided. Even children, who often ran barefoot across fields, could navigate rough terrain without injury, allowing them more freedom to explore, learn, and assist with household tasks. The sandals, it turned out, had enhanced not just mobility but opportunity. Hermes also noticed an unexpected consequence. The practice of tending the sandals fostered a sense of responsibility and attentiveness. Villagers who had once neglected their footwear now polished, repaired, and adjusted them regularly. In doing so, they cultivated habits of care that extended to other aspects of life. Attention to tools, livestock, and crops improved noticeably. Hermes realized that his invention, modest as it seemed, had become a framework for instilling diligence, patience, and foresight in the people who wore it. The god did not stop at the village. Word of the sandals spread to nearby towns, and travelers visiting the experimental village noticed the difference immediately. Reports reached city officials and neighboring communities. Messengers arrived faster, goods were delivered in better condition, and overall travel efficiency increased. Hermes quietly took note of these developments, recognizing that small innovations could ripple outward to create societal improvements far larger than their immediate purpose. The sandals were a tool, yes, but they also functioned as a vector for influence, transmitting habits of care and attention across regions. Hermes, naturally, was not content to leave the process static. Over time, he introduced minor enhancements, soles with improved traction for slippery paths, lightweight reinforcement for rocky terrain, and subtly curved arches to better support the foot. Each iteration was carefully tested by mortals under real-world conditions. Failure was acceptable, even desirable, for it provided new insights. A strap that broke under excessive load revealed weaknesses to be corrected, a sole that wore unevenly indicated areas needing reinforcement. Hermes' experimental approach ensured that the sandals would evolve in tandem with the humans who depended on them. An intriguing byproduct emerged in the village's culture. Travel became more predictable, reliable, and even enjoyable. Messengers took pride in their speed and accuracy, knowing that the sandals supported their efforts. Young children learned from watching older siblings navigate paths efficiently. Elders previously skeptical of innovation began to acknowledge the benefits of deliberate experimentation. The sandals had, in effect, created a culture that valued observation, iteration, and consistent improvement. Hermes quietly appreciated this, understanding that the greatest inventions are those that shape not only actions but also thinking. Even so, challenges remained. Mortals by nature could be careless. Some failed to maintain their footwear, others disregarded advice, and a few neglected the lessons entirely. Hermes understood that perfection was impossible to enforce. The value of his work depended on voluntary diligence. The true measure of success, he realized, lay in whether humans could internalize the principles underlying the invention: attentiveness, patience, and an understanding of cause and effect. In this sense, the sandals were both practical and pedagogical, a device for teaching life skills as well as easing travel. Years passed, and the village evolved around the experiment. Paths became more regularly maintained, communal workshops appeared to repair and produce sandals, and trade routes expanded to neighboring regions. The practice of careful observation, meticulous repair, and iterative improvement took root in ways Hermes had not initially anticipated. Mortals developed a rudimentary form of quality control, documenting which designs worked best under specific conditions. This knowledge, transmitted orally and through hands-on demonstration, formed the basis for a modest but enduring tradition of craftsmanship. Hermes occasionally returned in subtle ways. Travelers would report glimpses of a winged figure observing tests from a distance, adjusting straps with invisible hands, or whispering guidance in dreams to master artisans. Whether real or imagined, the god's influence became part of the village's cultural memory. Stories circulated of a divine inventor who cared not for grandeur, but for the everyday improvement of life. The sandals, and the diligence they inspired, became symbols of thoughtful attention to detail, careful planning, and practical wisdom. In the larger context of Greek society, the experiment had long-term implications. The practical improvements to travel efficiency allowed for faster communication between settlements, more reliable trade, and increased cohesion among communities. Over time, these effects contributed subtly to social organization, economic stability, and even the ability of Athens and surrounding regions to respond to crises. Hermes' sandals were not merely shoes, they were instruments that supported the rhythm and connectivity of civilization itself. Yet the story of Hermes' experiment carried a quiet lesson beyond its immediate benefits. Innovation alone is insufficient. Without care, observation, and willingness to learn, even the most ingenious designs fail to reach their potential. The sandals were successful not because Hermes was clever, but because humans participated actively in their testing, refinement, and maintenance. The gods' patience and guidance were critical, but the enduring impact arose from collaboration, repeated practice, and attention to detail, values that the villagers gradually incorporated into broader aspects of their lives. The ultimate legacy of the great sandal-making experiment, therefore, was twofold. Practically, it improved the comfort, efficiency, and safety of travel for generations of mortals. Culturally, it instilled habits of observation, care, and iterative learning that extended beyond footwear. In essence, Hermes had used a simple, tangible invention to shape human behavior in a lasting and subtle way. As the sun set over the hills, Hermes observed a group of young villagers running along a familiar path. Their sandals, carefully maintained, fit snugly and moved with their feet. Messages were delivered faster, errands completed with ease, and laughter accompanied steps that would once have been burdensome. The god allowed himself a rare smile. His experiment had worked, not perfectly, but meaningfully. The sandals would continue to evolve, and humans would continue to learn, stumble, and adapt. Each generation faced the same unresolved question. Would they uphold the discipline, attention, and care necessary to preserve and enhance the invention? Hermes, ever patient, knew the answer would be revealed in the slow rhythm of practice over time, in the small but significant choices of mortals. In the end, the great sandal-making experiment was more than a story of divine ingenuity. It was a quiet testament to the interplay between human effort and thoughtful guidance, between invention and responsibility. It demonstrated that even the smallest improvements, a simple strap here, a reinforced sole there, could ripple outward to influence travel, communication, commerce, and culture. And it reminded mortals, in the gentlest of ways, that deliberate attention and care, applied consistently, could shape not only their own lives but the trajectory of entire communities. Hermes' sandals became, in time, a metaphor for patience, for diligence, and for the profound effects of thoughtful intervention. Travelers continued to wear them, messages continued to flow faster, and generations learned that progress, like a well-crafted sandal, required both design and discipline. The god of messengers had invented more than footwear. He had, subtly and effectively, nudged civilization forward, one careful step at a time. In a quiet corner of 14th-century Paris, far from the bustling streets and clanging bells of the marketplaces, there existed a small apothecary that seemed almost forgotten by time. Its wooden sign, weathered and slightly crooked, simply read herboristery, and a faint aroma of dried herbs, vinegar, and oils lingered constantly in the air. This was the workspace of Master Etienne, a man of moderate reputation, whose life revolved around the slow, methodical preparation of remedies, tinctures, and powders. Etienne's days were filled with what many might call mundane tasks: grinding dried leaves into fine powders, steeping roots in alcohol to extract their properties, simmering honey and herbs to create salves, and carefully labeling each concoction with elegant but precise handwriting. To the untrained eye, these were merely repetitive chores, but to Etienne, every action carried significance. A misstep could render a mixture ineffective, while meticulous attention might produce relief for a patient who had suffered for weeks. The work demanded patience, precision, and a keen understanding of natural ingredients. The apothecary's shelves were crowded with countless jars, each containing something obscure: powdered foxglove, powdered iris root, dried rosemary, beeswax, crushed coral, powdered bark from distant forests, and even small vials of metals like mercury and antimony, whose uses were carefully calibrated. Etienne maintained careful notes on the provenance of each ingredient, whether it had come from local fields, traded from distant ports, or grown in the greenhouse at the back of the shop. For him, every component had a story, a subtle quality, and a potential effect that required study and respect. One particularly curious object on the shelf was a thin, faded manuscript, a fragment of a recipe book left by his mentor. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, ink smudged in places, yet the instructions hinted at remedies that might relieve fever, ease digestion, or restore sleep. There was one recipe in particular, written in a script that almost seemed to shift under the eye, labeled only as elixir of calm slumber. Etienne had long been fascinated by it, but the instructions were incomplete. Measurements were vague, some ingredients were obscure, and the method of preparation was partly illegible. Despite these challenges, Etienne felt a quiet thrill at the thought of completing the recipe. It was not ambition that drove him. He did not seek fame, wealth, or recognition, but curiosity and a desire for quiet mastery. Night after night, he would work by candlelight, carefully experimenting with different combinations, adjusting proportions, and observing subtle effects on small test samples. He noted the texture, color, aroma, and even subtle reactions of the mixtures to temperature and light. The apothecary's routines were unhurried and deliberate. Etienne carefully sterilized his tools, washed glassware, and monitored the simmering of various infusions. Each step was conducted with a sense of ritual, a rhythm that made the work almost meditative. He often mused quietly on the wisdom embedded in old recipes. The ancestors who wrote them had observed nature for decades, patiently noting the effects of herbs, minerals, and techniques. Their seemingly boring attention to detail revealed an intricate understanding of balance, patience, and subtle cause and effect relationships. Occasionally, curious apprentices or neighbors would enter the shop. They often asked simple questions. Which herb eases a cough, or what soothes a stomachache? Etienne would answer with calm, precise guidance, sometimes demonstrating a crushing technique or proper infusion time. To an outsider, these demonstrations seemed slow and unnecessarily meticulous, yet every gesture was intentional, each choice informed by years of observation and careful experimentation. One autumn evening, as the city's streets were damp with rain and the smell of wood smoke drifted into the shop, Etienne returned to the fragment of the elixir of calm slumber. He noticed that a faint trace of an ingredient had been overlooked in prior attempts: dried chamomile flowers mixed with a small proportion of valerian root. These herbs, he remembered from his notes, were known for gentle sedative properties. The challenge, of course, was to combine them correctly with other ingredients like honey, cinnamon, and a carefully measured portion of rosewater, without losing potency. A misstep might not be dangerous, but it would render the elixir ineffective, and he would have to start over. Etienne began a delicate process of trial and observation. He steeped chamomile in lukewarm water for precisely 15 minutes, then combined it with a small amount of crushed valerian root. The mixture released a faintly earthy aroma, mellowed by the sweetness of honey and subtle warmth of cinnamon. Each stirring motion was deliberate, gentle, designed to preserve the volatile properties of the herbs. He reflected quietly on the slow rhythm of this work. Unlike the frantic pace of city life outside, here in the apothecary, time seemed elastic, almost unhurried, shaped by the careful unfolding of natural processes rather than external demands. Yet even in this calm routine, the work required vigilance. Overheating the infusion could destroy delicate oils. Understirring could result in uneven potency. Etienne consulted his notes, cross-referenced with observations of prior experiments, and made micro-adjustments. He recorded the temperature of the liquid, the precise weight of each powdered herb, the timing of each stir, and the rate at which honey dissolved into the mixture. To most, these details would seem trivial, but to Etienne, they formed a lattice of cause and effect, a framework by which successful results could emerge. As the evening deepened, he poured the partially completed elixir into a small vial. Its color was a pale gold, faintly translucent, with wisps of aroma curling from the narrow neck. He tasted a minuscule amount, noting a mild bitterness tempered by the warmth of honey and cinnamon. Promising though incomplete, Etienne realized that the final step, adding a small, secret ingredient, indicated only by a nearly illegible symbol in the manuscript, would be crucial to achieving the intended effect. Without it, the elixir would be merely pleasant, not transformative. His curiosity and anticipation deepened. What was this missing component? Was it a rare herb now forgotten, a mineral compound, or a precise technique for combining the existing ingredients? The manuscript offered no explicit guidance, only a hint: add the essence as the moon rises, with hand steady and heart patient. Etienne pondered what this could mean, weighing historical practice, seasonal availability, and traditional knowledge passed down orally in whispers from master to apprentice. Night after night, he continued experimenting, adjusting ratios and techniques, observing subtle changes in texture, aroma, and effect. Each attempt brought incremental insights, small revelations about the interactions between ingredients, and deeper understanding of the patience and observation required. To outsiders, this might seem repetitive or mundane, yet it was in these tiny, careful adjustments that the essence of discovery lay. The apothecary became a quiet laboratory of patience. Candles burned low, casting flickering shadows over dusty shelves and jars, while Etienne's hands worked steadily, almost ritualistically. The rhythm of his labor, measuring, mixing, recording, observing, created a meditative pattern, as if time itself had slowed within these walls. He began to notice minor patterns. Chamomile and valerian seemed most effective when infused sequentially rather than simultaneously. Honey acted as a stabilizer, prolonging aroma and efficacy. A gentle final stir improved homogeneity and potency. Even as he approached a breakthrough, an unresolved question lingered. What exactly was the final essence called for in the manuscript, and could it still be located or replicated? Without it, the elixir remained tantalizingly incomplete, promising yet unrealized. Etienne's curiosity and patience were tested, for the final success depended on both interpretation and experimentation. A delicate dance between knowledge inherited and insights discovered. And so, in the quiet of his medieval shop, Etienne continued, steeped in dust, candlelight, and faint herbal aroma. The elixir of calm slumber remained partially elusive, its full effect just beyond reach. Each day brought small progress, each night a new opportunity to inch closer to the original lost recipe. The question hung in the air, unresolved. Would centuries of careful observation, meticulous recording, and patient experimentation finally yield the true elixir, or would its secret remain hidden, a reminder of the quiet, persistent challenge of mastering even the simplest seeming tasks? The days in Etienne's apothecary passed slowly, measured by the rhythm of grinding, steeping, and careful observation. Each new attempt at the elixir of calm slumber revealed subtle lessons, and the process itself became a meditation on patience. He learned to read the nuances of each herb, the way chamomile's petals lost their pale yellow hue when overheated, or how valerian root released its characteristic aroma only after being crushed at a precise angle. Even the honey, thick and golden, behaved differently depending on the season, subtly affecting the taste, texture, and preservation of the concoction. Etienne began keeping more detailed notes, recording observations about light, temperature, humidity, and the relative freshness of ingredients. He found that the same recipe prepared at different times of day or under different air conditions produced surprisingly variable outcomes. This led him to consider factors beyond mere measurement: the environment itself, subtle variations in air currents, the wax of candles burning unevenly in his small workshop, even the steadiness of his own hands as he stirred. The missing element of the manuscript continued to fascinate him. A symbol, worn faintly into the parchment, suggested an ingredient or step long forgotten. Etienne scoured his shelves, examining rare imports from Italy and Spain, local herbs collected by apothecaries' guilds, and even roots and barks that grew quietly outside Paris. Each new candidate was tested in small quantities, and each result was carefully recorded. Some mixtures were too bitter, others too sweet, a few were entirely inert, producing no effect at all. Yet even these failures were instructive. They helped Etienne refine his understanding of ratios, interactions, and the subtle alchemy inherent in medieval herbalism. Occasionally, apprentices visited the shop, their curiosity mingled with boredom at the slow pace of experimentation. Etienne demonstrated proper techniques: how to crush herbs without losing essential oils, how to combine liquid and powdered ingredients to avoid clumping, how to maintain steady heat over a simmering bath of plant matter. The young visitors were sometimes impatient, eager for dramatic results, but Etienne remained calm. He explained, "The magic lies in observation and patience, not in haste or spectacle." Even a minor misstep can change the effect entirely. Beyond technical precision, Etienne considered the philosophical aspect of his work. Remedies were not merely chemical concoctions, they were interfaces between human effort, natural properties, and subtle environmental factors. Each mixture carried a rhythm of preparation, an alignment of material, time, and intention. In this sense, his apothecary was as much a laboratory for human diligence and care as it was a place for producing tangible effects. Ooh. One morning, a local physician brought a patient whose insomnia had persisted for weeks. The man had tried every common remedy, warm milk, chamomile teas, and even mild tinctures recommended by fellow apothecaries. Etienne offered the patient a trial version of his elixir, carefully crafted with chamomile, valerian, honey, and a hint of cinnamon. He observed the man's reaction closely, the initial bitterness of the mixture, the warming effect as it touched the tongue, and the gentle calming aroma that seemed to fill the room. To Etienne's quiet satisfaction, the patient's discomfort eased slightly. Not complete relief, but enough to indicate that his approach was moving in the right direction. Each successful step encouraged him, reinforcing his understanding that incremental refinement, guided by observation and meticulous record-keeping, could produce tangible improvements even when full mastery remained elusive. Ooh. The process of experimentation extended beyond taste and effect. Etienne considered preservation, how to store the elixir to prevent spoilage, how to seal vials effectively, and how temperature and light exposure influenced longevity. Medieval apothecaries faced constant challenges in this regard, relying on practical ingenuity rather than precise instruments. Etienne employed wax seals, tightly fitted corks, and shaded storage to maintain stability. Each step required careful attention. A lapse could ruin weeks of careful preparation. As weeks turned into months, Etienne began testing minor variations in technique. Sometimes he infused the chamomile first, other times the valerian, observing subtle differences in aroma and efficacy. The honey's temperature was adjusted minutely, and cinnamon was added at varying points in the process. Even the hand-stirring pattern mattered. Clockwise versus counterclockwise motions produced slightly different textures and effects, something the manuscript hinted at in its enigmatic notation. The process was slow and repetitive, yet profoundly immersive. Etienne began to notice subtle patterns, how the herb's qualities shifted depending on the moisture in the air, how minute differences in particle size altered the elixir's behavior, and how even the type of wooden spoon used for stirring could affect extraction. Each observation, seemingly trivial, contributed to a deeper understanding of the delicate interactions between ingredients, process, and environmental conditions. And yet, despite these insights, the final element of the recipe remained unresolved. Etienne considered consulting other apothecaries, but he hesitated. Much of medieval knowledge was guarded closely, passed down in oral traditions or carefully annotated manuscripts. Moreover, he felt that discovery through patient experimentation would yield insights not just about the elixir, but about the principles underlying all careful preparation. The missing component, whether it was an herb, a mineral, or a subtle method of handling, had to be understood in context, not merely added as a foreign element. One evening, while examining a rare root sent from the Italian coast, Etienne had a minor revelation. The manuscript's instruction, "Add the essence as the moon rises, with hand steady and heart patient," might not refer to a single ingredient, but rather a technique, the timing and method of integration. Perhaps the missing piece was not something tangible, but the practice of infusing, stirring, and combining with deliberate attention under specific environmental conditions. This interpretation opened a new avenue of experimentation, emphasizing process over component. Etienne began testing this theory. He timed his infusions to coincide with the rising moon, adjusting stirring speed and sequence precisely. He noticed subtle changes in aroma and texture, and small but measurable effects on the patience and attentiveness required to complete the preparation. While the final effect remained partially elusive, he felt he was moving closer to the essence of the original recipe, not merely replicating it mechanically, but understanding it holistically. By the end of this section of experimentation, Etienne had achieved partial success. The elixir produced mild calm in test subjects, easing restlessness and preparing the mind for sleep, though the profound effect described in the manuscript remained slightly beyond reach. He realized that discovery was iterative, cumulative, and reliant on careful observation, patience, and refinement. The work was far from finished, yet the process itself had taught as much as the outcome. The unresolved question persisted: could Etienne uncover the full secret of the elixir of calm slumber, or would its final component remain lost to time, a reminder of the slow, persistent challenge inherent in mastering even seemingly simple remedies? His curiosity and determination remained, guiding him toward the next phase of exploration. As winter crept across Paris, cloaking the city in grey skies and damp streets, Master Etienne's apothecary remained a sanctuary of quiet diligence. Candlelight flickered against jars of dried herbs, polished wooden counters, and the parchment of ancient manuscripts. Within these walls, time seemed to slow, governed not by the bustle of market crowds or the ringing of cathedral bells, but by the steady rhythm of careful observation, precise measurement, and deliberate action. Etienne's work on the elixir of calm slumber had progressed beyond simple trial and error. Through months of meticulous experimentation, he had cultivated an understanding not only of ingredients but of method. The careful timing of infusions, the sequence of combining herbs, the subtle influence of temperature and ambient light. Even the rising moon, previously a poetic symbol, had become a guide for measuring the slow release of essential properties in his mixtures. Each element interacted with the others, creating a delicate harmony that required patience to preserve. The day finally arrived when Etienne, with steady hands and practiced eyes, combined chamomile, valerian root, honey, a faint touch of cinnamon, and the final, nuanced technique hinted at in the manuscript. He poured the liquid into a small vial, observing the golden elixir as it caught the dim light. It smelled faintly of earth and warmth, with a sweetness that was neither cloying nor overpowering. He tasted an infinitesimal amount and felt the first subtle wave of calm, a gentle relaxation of thought, a softening of mental tension, a quieting of the restless energy that had accompanied so many sleepless nights. Word of the elixir's effects began to spread slowly. Patients suffering from insomnia or minor anxiety sought it out, and while results varied, most reported improved ease in falling asleep and a more restful night. Etienne did not claim miracles. He understood the limitations of his craft. Instead, he emphasized careful use, small, measured doses, proper attention to preparation and storage, and continued observation of effects. The apothecary became a place of gentle guidance, where the rhythm of careful labor intersected with the practical needs of daily life. Interestingly, the process of perfecting the elixir had effects beyond the formula itself. Etienne noticed that those who observed the preparation developed habits of patience, attentiveness, and meticulous care. Apprentices learned that small details, a slight adjustment in stirring, careful weighing of herbs, or timing infusions with natural rhythms, could yield measurable improvements. These lessons, imparted quietly through demonstration rather than didactic instruction, became part of the village's culture. The meticulousness required for one small elixir translated into habits of careful observation and respect for detail in other areas of life. Etienne, for his part, reflected on the nature of success. The elixir of calm slumber was not revolutionary in the sense of dramatic cures. It did not dazzle or astonish. Its power lay in subtlety, the gradual, cumulative effect of careful preparation, deliberate technique, and attentive observation. In this sense, the elixir embodied the essence of the apothecary's art, a deep understanding of cause and effect, the patience to observe and refine, and the discipline to maintain standards over time. The manuscript, once an incomplete and frustrating guide, had served as more than a set of instructions. It had been a teacher, encouraging Etienne to approach his work with attentiveness, methodical experimentation, and quiet persistence. Even the enigmatic symbols and faded notes had contributed, prompting him to consider timing, sequence, and subtle technique. In mastering the recipe, he had learned to interpret not only the words on the page but the principles underlying them. Principles that could be applied to countless other aspects of life and craft. The elixir's influence spread subtly but steadily. Merchants who traveled late into the night for trade or long-distance communication began using it to rest more effectively, which improved their efficiency during the day. Scholars and scribes discovered that restful sleep allowed for greater clarity and patience in their work. Farmers and laborers experienced improved recovery, enhancing their capacity for careful, consistent labor. In each case, the benefit was incremental, quiet, and often unnoticed, yet cumulatively significant. The ripple effect of careful preparation, observation, and applied knowledge extended far beyond the confines of the small apothecary. Etienne continued to refine the elixir, adjusting the infusion and stirring technique with each new batch. Minor innovations emerged over time, yet the core lesson remained unchanged. Slow, deliberate attention, combined with careful observation and respect for natural processes, produced outcomes more reliable and meaningful than hurried or thoughtless experimentation. This quiet triumph, the interplay of patience, method, and subtle insight, became the defining characteristic of the apothecary's craft. Beyond practical effects, there was a philosophical dimension to the work. Etienne had discovered that even mundane tasks could reveal profound truths about cause, effect, and human capability. The meticulous effort required for preparation, combined with the necessity of observation and adaptation, mirrored larger principles of life itself. Slow progress, patient refinement, and attentive care could yield enduring results. In this sense, the elixir of calm slumber became a metaphor for human diligence and the quiet satisfaction of disciplined work. The manuscript's final secret, while partially revealed through experimentation, remained a reminder that some knowledge is elusive, requiring interpretation, patience, and persistence. Etienne's success was as much about cultivating the capacity to learn and observe as it was about producing a functional elixir. His work demonstrated that careful attention to detail, informed by observation and guided by subtle instruction, could transform not only specific results, but broader habits, attitudes, and capacities. As the candlelight flickered on the shelves lined with jars and manuscripts, Etienne reflected on the journey. The elixir of calm slumber, once an incomplete puzzle, now existed as a tangible product of observation, patience, and refinement. Yet its greatest achievement was not in the golden liquid itself, but in the cultivation of skill, attention, and understanding that made the work possible. The quiet triumph of the apothecary lay not in fame or spectacle, but in the slow, cumulative effects of deliberate, careful effort. And so the story closes with a subtle reflection, and if progress, whether in apothecary work, craft, or life itself, rarely arrives through sudden leaps or dramatic revelation. It emerges instead from patient, attentive labor, careful observation, and the willingness to refine and adapt over time. Etienne's elixir, modest and unassuming, exemplified this truth, a reminder that even in quiet, repetitive work, human diligence can produce meaningful, lasting results. Yet the lingering question remains, softly unresolved: will future apothecaries preserve and understand these lessons, or will the intricacies of careful experimentation fade into obscurity, leaving only fragments of knowledge to whisper hints of a quiet, patient triumph? In the mid-19th century, when London streets were thick with fog and coal smoke, the problem of sleeplessness was more common than one might expect. Factories operated around the clock, gas lamps flickered through long nights, and the city's residents juggled long work hours, social obligations, and the persistent hum of urban life. Amid this backdrop, Victorians became increasingly concerned with insomnia, which doctors considered not merely an inconvenience, but a subtle threat to productivity, health, and moral character. The solution, however, was rarely dramatic. It relied on gentle routines, soothing beverages, and patient experimentation with herbs and household remedies. In the front room of a modest townhouse, a middle-class family prepared for bed with a series of carefully observed rituals. Mother and father, weary from a day of work and domestic management, moved through tasks methodically, shutters drawn to reduce flickering gaslight, a small fire tended to maintain warmth without stifling airflow, and tea prepared in measured portions. The children, used to the quiet rhythms of Victorian discipline, followed similar steps, aware that the timing and sequence of actions could influence the night's sleep. Central to these routines was the preparation of beverages infused with mild sedatives. Chamomile tea was a household staple, often supplemented with a small amount of valerian root, hops, or peppermint. Recipes varied slightly from home to home, and slight differences in steeping times, water temperature, or leaf quality could affect both flavor and efficacy. Housewives and domestic staff developed a keen eye for these subtleties, noting that oversteeping could produce bitterness, while understeeping diminished soothing qualities. These small acts of observation, repeated night after night, became a quiet science of relaxation, a domestic alchemy practiced in kitchens across the city. Tinctures also played a significant role in Victorian insomnia cures. Apothecaries offered solutions that combined alcohol, herbal extracts, and occasionally mineral supplements. While some mixtures were more potent than others, their use was always cautious, small doses administered before bed, often diluted in warm water or milk, and accompanied by guidance on timing. Manuals from the period recommended consistency, noting that irregular application could disturb circadian patterns or produce unintended restlessness. Even in an era before modern understanding of sleep cycles, Victorians recognized the importance of routine, preparation, and observation. One particular household kept a notebook detailing nightly routines, dosages, and observed effects on family members. Patterns emerged over time. The father, prone to anxious thoughts, responded best to chamomile infused for exactly 10 minutes, followed by a brief period of quiet reading. The mother found valerian in a honeyed water mixture more effective after a light supper, and the children's restfulness was enhanced when their rooms were slightly cooler and their beds meticulously arranged. In this way, the Victorian approach to insomnia combined experimentation, careful observation, and attention to environment, producing results that were individually tailored and subtly effective. Sleep itself was treated as a discipline. Bedtime was not simply a matter of lying down, it was a process of preparation. Bedding was adjusted for comfort and warmth, mattresses occasionally aired to reduce dampness, and pillows fluffed and aligned for optimal support. Even minor adjustments could influence restfulness. Housewives and servants alike understood that comfort was both practical and ritualistic. The act of preparing a sleeping environment became part of the slow, meditative transition from wakefulness to rest. In addition to teas and tinctures, Victorians employed sensory cues to encourage relaxation. Soft lighting, the faint scent of lavender or rosemary, and the muted sounds of evening routines contributed to a gentle signal that bedtime had arrived. Children were read stories in calm tones, while adults engaged in quiet conversation or reflective journaling. The city's external noise, clattering carts, distant footsteps, and the occasional carriage horn was mitigated by careful arrangement of rooms, drapes, and fireplace activity. All these factors, considered minor in isolation, coalesced into a holistic approach to sleep hygiene long before the term was coined. One apothecary, Mr. Aldridge, was particularly renowned for his expertise in preparing insomnia tinctures. His shop, nestled along a narrow cobblestone lane, contained shelves lined with glass vials, earthen jars, and metal tins filled with dried botanicals. He kept meticulous records of ingredient sources, noting which batches of chamomile, hops, or valerian were most effective during particular seasons. Customers often asked for recommendations tailored to individual circumstances, nervous anticipation, overwork, or sensitivity to environmental stimuli. Aldridge's approach emphasized trial, observation, and subtle refinement, creating remedies that were modestly potent, yet safe and consistently soothing. Interestingly, social and cultural attitudes influenced the practice as much as medicinal knowledge. Victorians associated sleeplessness with moral weakness or excess, and quiet, methodical routines were valued as expressions of self-discipline. The act of preparing teas, tinctures, and bedtime rituals reinforced a broader ethic of attentiveness and care, embedding habits that extended beyond the night's rest. Insomnia was not treated as a problem to be eradicated with forceful medication, but as a subtle imbalance to be corrected through observation, patience, and gentle intervention. Even minor failures contributed to knowledge. Families often noted which ingredients or methods failed to produce rest, gradually refining their routines. A tea steeped too long produced discomfort, while a warm bedroom that was too hot prevented deep sleep. Each small miscalculation became data, informing subsequent practice. Over time, this iterative approach allowed households to cultivate reliable methods for sleep, turning what might appear as repetitive or boring tasks into a subtle form of empirical science. By late evening, as London's fog thickened and gas lamps glimmered through the haze, the domestic routines reached their quiet conclusion. Teacups were emptied, tinctures administered, beds prepared, and the household settled into the rhythmic, unhurried transition to sleep. The process was slow, precise, and entirely intentional, yet its cumulative effect was remarkable. A community, or at least a household, moving through the city's nightly challenges with calm, deliberate efficiency. Even in an era of industrialization, noise, and stress, these small practices allowed Victorians to reclaim control over rest and recovery. The unresolved question, lingering as night deepened, was subtle yet compelling. Would these domestic experiments in patient observation, environmental adjustment, and careful use of herbal remedies be sufficient to combat the persistent and varied challenges of insomnia, or would new factors, stress, disease, industrial noise, require constant refinement, adaptation, and perhaps even novel inventions? The answer remained unknown, awaiting both the passage of time and the steady accumulation of practical insight. As autumn deepened into winter, households across London adapted their evening routines with increasing care, recognizing that the smallest details could influence the quality of sleep. Candles were trimmed to reduce flickering shadows, fireplaces were tended to maintain a gentle warmth without overwhelming heat, and windows were slightly opened to allow airflow while keeping drafts away from beds. Each adjustment, however minor it might seem, was part of a deliberate attempt to create an environment conducive to rest. Apothecaries played a central role in these nightly experiments. Mr. Aldridge, for example, spent long hours in his shop preparing tinctures and herbal infusions for clients who sought relief from restless nights. He maintained extensive records of each batch, noting the quality and origin of ingredients, the time of preparation, and the observed effects on recipients. Hops sourced from Kent behaved differently than those grown in Herefordshire. Chamomile harvested in late summer retained a more robust aroma and calming effect than that gathered in early spring. These subtle observations became part of an informal body of knowledge, cultivated through patient trial, careful recording, and ongoing refinement. Families incorporated these remedies into nightly rituals with the same meticulous attention. A small vial of tincture might be diluted in warm milk, a cup of chamomile tea steeped precisely for 10 minutes, or a pillow sprinkled lightly with lavender. The sensory environment was equally important. Gentle lighting, muted conversations, and soft textile arrangements contributed to a psychological state of readiness for sleep. Even the rhythm of movement in the household mattered. Quiet, unhurried gestures reinforced the sense that rest was approaching, creating a subtle internal cue for the body to prepare. Observation was the cornerstone of effective insomnia management. Mothers and caregivers often recorded the timing and effectiveness of each intervention. One household noted that a cup of chamomile taken too late in the evening caused drowsiness that lingered inconveniently into the morning, while tinctures with higher alcohol content occasionally led to lightheadedness rather than calm sleep. Each discrepancy informed future adjustments, transforming mundane acts of preparation into a continuous process of empirical discovery. Children, too, became participants in this careful experimentation. Parents observed how subtle changes influenced bedtime compliance and restfulness, arranging the bed in a particular orientation, adjusting blankets to maintain consistent warmth, or timing story reading to precede sleep by a precise interval. Young observers began internalizing these rhythms, developing habits of awareness, attentiveness, and consistency. The act of going to bed became a lesson in subtle cause and effect, instilling discipline, patience, and sensitivity to environmental cues. Apothecaries' influence extended into subtle social networks. Word-of-mouth recommendations guided new households in selecting remedies and practices. Local clubs, charitable societies, and social visits allowed shared observation. Families compared the effectiveness of various teas, tinctures, and bedtime routines, exchanging insights on methods, preparation techniques, and ingredient quality. Over time, this informal knowledge network became a community-wide repository of wisdom regarding insomnia, accumulated through slow, patient refinement rather than dramatic discovery. One particularly notable trend involved the combination of tea and tincture use. Chamomile or peppermint teas were often used to establish a baseline of relaxation, while mild herbal tinctures were introduced in small, controlled doses to reinforce calmness. The interplay between these two approaches required careful observation, timing, order of administration, and proportion had measurable effects on sleep quality. Families who experimented systematically discovered nuanced patterns, adjusting rituals according to individual sensitivity, seasonal changes, and environmental factors. Apothecaries also explored seasonal influences. During long winter nights, heavier infusions with warming spices, such as cinnamon or nutmeg, were preferred, while spring and summer favored lighter, more aromatic combinations. Air quality, light exposure, and temperature fluctuations were monitored to optimize outcomes. These small considerations, while seemingly trivial, reflected a deep understanding of context-specific intervention, an early, homegrown appreciation for environmental psychology applied to human physiology. In parallel, domestic diaries documented the cumulative effects of these practices. Families observed not only whether sleep was achieved, but also the quality, depth, and duration of rest. Children's health, household productivity, and general mood were quietly assessed and correlated with nightly routines. Minor failures, oversteeping, insufficient cooling of rooms, or incorrect dilution of tinctures were recorded and adjusted for future nights. These iterative refinements created a slow but steady progression toward improved rest, reflecting a mindset of incremental learning and attentive care. Even in the quietude of the apothecary shop, innovation persisted. Mr. Aldridge experimented with alternative methods of preparation, infusing herbs in double boilers, combining multiple botanicals in specific sequences, or gently macerating leaves to enhance extraction. Each adjustment was tested on small quantities, and effects were carefully noted. Occasionally he consulted with other practitioners to discuss subtle differences observed in ingredient quality, water sources, and storage methods. In this way, the art of insomnia remedies became a collaborative exercise in observation, patience, and gentle experimentation. By late evening, families would enact their refined routines, tea sipped, tinctures administered, rooms arranged, and candles dimmed. The household settled into a rhythm of calm. The atmosphere was quiet, measured, and attentive, emphasizing not the elimination of sleeplessness through forceful means, but the cultivation of conditions conducive to rest. Children drifted into slumber under the soft guidance of routine. Adults found that the combination of sensory, environmental, and herbal interventions facilitated the gradual descent into restorative sleep. Through this process, Victorians discovered a subtle truth: effective remedies for insomnia relied less on dramatic interventions than on patient, attentive practice. Observation, incremental adjustment, and a commitment to careful, repeated action proved more reliable than single forceful treatments. The combination of tea, tinctures, environment, and ritual reflected a holistic understanding of rest, demonstrating that even in the midst of industrialized urban life, small deliberate acts could produce meaningful improvements. Yet the underlying question remained unresolved. As city life continued to accelerate, factories hummed, gaslights glimmered, and social pressures mounted. Would these domestic practices remain sufficient to preserve rest and calm, or would the ever-changing demands of Victorian life necessitate continual innovation, refinement, and adaptation? The answer would unfold gradually, night by night, through observation, patience, and quiet experimentation. As winter deepened and London's fog thickened, households that had patiently cultivated evening routines began to see subtle, cumulative effects. Sleep became less elusive for those who followed the methods developed over months of observation, trial, and refinement. Tea and tinctures, carefully dosed and timed, were now accompanied by the rituals of preparation and attentive arrangement of rooms. What had once seemed a minor domestic chore had become a deliberate practice, blending herbal knowledge, environmental awareness, and mindful attention to the human body's natural rhythms. Mr. Aldridge's apothecary thrived quietly in this context. His shop, lined with glass vials, labeled jars, and bundles of dried herbs, was a center of learning as much as a place of commerce. Customers seeking relief from insomnia were treated not with hasty prescriptions but with careful counsel. Aldridge observed patterns in each case, the effects of specific herb combinations, the influence of room temperature and light, and even the subtle impacts of timing and sequence. Over time, his records revealed consistent principles. Modest, repeated interventions, when aligned with the natural rhythm of the household, produced the most reliable results. Families continued to integrate these lessons into domestic life. They discovered that restorative sleep was rarely the result of a single herb or tincture, it was the sum of multiple small practices. Children who initially resisted bedtime adapted to the gentle, consistent rhythms, learning that the gradual unfolding of quiet tasks facilitated rest. Adults observed their own responses, noting that relaxation deepened when environmental and herbal elements were harmonized. The process encouraged mindfulness, attention to small details, deliberate pacing, and observation of subtle effects. The Victorian approach to insomnia, in its patient and iterative nature, offers a quiet lesson in applied observation. Teas were steeped with care, tinctures were diluted and administered with precision, bedtime rituals unfolded in a deliberate sequence. Even failures, oversteeping, miscalculating doses, or arranging rooms inefficiently contributed to growing knowledge. Households developed an empirical sense of cause and effect, each action had a consequence, and attention to detail mattered. In this way, domestic life itself became a slow, practical laboratory of behavioral and environmental science. Interestingly, these routines also reinforced broader social and cultural values. Sleep was not merely a biological necessity but a reflection of order, discipline, and attentiveness. The household's deliberate rhythms aligned with Victorian ideals of propriety, calmness, and careful stewardship of health. Intending to sleep, families cultivated habits that extended to work, study, and social behavior. The quiet, repetitive labor of preparing teas, tinctures, and bedrooms reinforced a sense of responsibility and observation that resonated throughout daily life. Some households, motivated by curiosity and diligence, began experimenting with subtle variations, different ratios of herbs, small adjustments in the timing of administration, and minor environmental changes were tested systematically. Each experiment produced insights, gradually refining the effectiveness of remedies and rituals. Patterns emerged: the precise steeping time of chamomile, the gentle warmth of milk, the subtle fragrance of lavender, and the sequence of room preparations all contributed to improved outcomes. Knowledge accumulated incrementally, guided by patient observation rather than abrupt innovation. The apothecary's guidance extended to sensory cues as well. Dimming lights gradually, softening voices, and minimizing sudden movements reinforced the body's anticipation of rest. Even the act of moving through the home quietly, performing each task with calm precision, became part of the sleep-inducing ritual. Victorian families discovered that the combination of environmental cues, herbal remedies, and deliberate pacing produced effects far greater than any single intervention. The interplay of small factors created a cumulative, soothing effect that prepared the mind and body for sleep. Over time, the collective practice of these routines had subtle social consequences. Households became calmer, interactions more measured, and children more attuned to patterns of cause and effect. Productivity during waking hours improved, not through intense labor alone, but through the restorative quality of sleep. The city itself benefited quietly from these cumulative effects. Residents better rested, families more harmonious, and social life conducted with slightly greater efficiency and patience. Yet, as always, questions lingered. Industrialization, urban expansion, and social pressures were relentless. Would these carefully cultivated rituals remain sufficient in the face of growing noise, stress, and the demands of Victorian life? Could families continue to observe and refine, maintaining the discipline required for restorative sleep, or would adaptation be necessary as new challenges arose? The answers were not immediate, they unfolded night by night, shaped by observation, patience, and subtle experimentation. In the end, the Victorian approach to insomnia offers more than historical curiosity. It demonstrates the quiet power of methodical attention and cumulative effort. Sleep, like so many aspects of life, is influenced not by dramatic interventions but by patient observation, careful refinement, and the deliberate shaping of environment, behavior, and expectation. Teas, tinctures, and bedtime rituals are modest tools, yet when combined with thoughtful attention, they produce effects that ripple through health, productivity, and social harmony. The legacy of these practices endures as a testament to patience and subtle experimentation. Even in the absence of modern sleep science, Victorian households achieved practical results through careful observation, iterative refinement, and mindfulness of cause and effect. The process itself, measured, deliberate, attentive, was as valuable as the outcomes, cultivating habits of careful observation and thoughtful care that extended far beyond bedtime. As candles burned low in townhouses across London, families settled into beds prepared with care. The soft warmth of tea and tinctures, the gentle scent of herbs, and the quiet rhythms of practiced routines combined to ease restless minds. Sleep arrived slowly but reliably, a reward for patient attention, careful observation, and consistent application of modest remedies. In these unassuming practices, the Victorians discovered a quiet triumph. The art of rest, cultivated patiently, methodically, and thoughtfully. And yet the unresolved question persists, softly echoing into the night as life accelerates and demands shift. Will the principles of observation, patience, and deliberate care remain sufficient to secure rest, or will each generation be compelled to rediscover these subtle truths through its own slow experimentation?